Good morning, everyone. On behalf of the ISO, I'd like to welcome you to the Interconnection Process Enhancements 2023 Track 3 Stakeholder Call to discuss the Track 3 final proposal, which was posted last week on February 19th. My name is Elena Kopolov-Alford, representing ISO Stakeholder Affairs, and I'll be facilitating the web conference today. I'm joined by Bob Emmert, Senior Manager at Interconnection Resources, Danielle Mills, Principal in Infrastructure Policy Development, Robert Sparks, Senior Manager for Regional Transmission in the Southern Region, and Benay Shrestha, Manager in the Regional Transmission North Division. Before we get started, just a quick reminder, these materials related to this meeting are going to be available on the Interconnection Process Enhancements Initiative page. You can get to that page by going to kaiso.com and navigating to the Stakeholder Center tab at the top, selecting Policy Initiatives, and that'll take you to our main initiative landing page. From there, you can navigate to the APE page, and the latest documents will be at the very top of that page. And that's also where the recording will be posted after the fact. So this call is being recorded for informational and convenience purposes only. Any related transcription should not be reprinted without the ISO's permission. And these meetings are collaborative and intended to stimulate open dialogue and engage different perspectives, but please keep your comments professional and respectful. And please try and be brief and refrain from repeating what's already been said so we can manage our time efficiently today. If you need technical assistance during the meeting, please send a chat to the event producer. They are listed as Intalor Events, and today's event producer is Silas. For raising your hand, first make sure you open the participant and chat panels at the bottom right of your screen, and the raise hand icon is located at the bottom of the participant panel. If you connected to your audio outside of the WebEx, you can select *3 to get into the question queue. Please remember to state your name and affiliation anytime you raise your hand to make a question or comment, and you can send your questions in the chat to myself or to all panelists. So our agenda for today, after the welcome and introductions, I'm going to hand it over to Robert Sparks for intra-cluster prioritization. And Bob Emmert is going to cover modifications to TPD allocation. And then the second, financial security posting for cluster 14 parked projects. And then we're going to be taking an extended lunch today. We had a conflict come up, so we're going to have to take a little slightly longer lunch so that we can make sure we have Danielle Mills there for her section to cover identification of long lead time resources. And after that, we will be wrapping up. So our objective today is just to answer any questions and respond to stakeholder feedback on the final proposal that we posted. And here's where we are in our stakeholder process. The final proposal has been posted, and we are here at our last meeting before we get comments and seek board approval. And I'm going to hand it over to Danielle Mills here.
Thanks, Elena. And I'll just briefly characterize some of the changes that we made from the draft final proposal in this final proposal. We'll go into more detail on this certainly in the next couple of hours. So you can hold your questions for the section where it comes up. But just to kind of summarize, we did make a lot of clarifications and did some fine tuning of the intra-cluster prioritization proposal, and I would characterize the TPD allocation proposal the same, that it's a lot of clarifications and refinements, specifically around partial capacity deliverability status projects and multi-fuel projects, as well as how we account for the timing for cluster 15. And then potentially the most significant change is that we scaled back on the proposal around long lead time resources. We are no longer proposing to allow long lead time resources the opportunity to defer their first attempt to seek transmission plan deliverability. We will still consider that in a future IPE initiative, but right now the proposal just speaks to how we will go about identifying long lead time resources and put some additional detail around reservations of capacity associated with those long lead time resources. So with that, I think we can go into the intra-cluster prioritization section with Robert. Robert, I think you're on mute. We can't hear you.
Oh, thank you. Thank you, Danielle, and good morning. Can we move to the next slide, please? So as we discussed in the earlier stakeholder meetings, several long lead time reliability upgrades were identified for cluster 14, mostly due to the excessive amount of generation in the queue. And it is thought that a subset of the generation in cluster 14 could probably interconnect sooner without having to wait for those upgrades. Study results sort of demonstrated that. But we don't know which generators could move forward and which ones couldn't. So this initiative is intended to take advantage of the opportunity of allowing some generators to move forward without having to wait for the long lead time upgrades. Next slide, please. So the ISO is proposing an allocation process to allow generators within the same cluster to interconnect up to an amount that would not trigger the need for required long lead time upgrades. The process would be similar to the TPD allocation process, and we've been talking about this for several months, and there's been general support for the proposal, although there has been several clarifications and refinements, as Danielle mentioned, to the proposal, and you know, the paper's been posted, so hopefully you see a lot of those, and this is kind of a high-level overview of what the proposal is at this point. Next slide, please. So the proposal is that all reliability network upgrades with an estimated time to construct of 4 or more years and that are delaying the in-service date of generation by 2 or more years would be considered in this process. That's actually one of the refinements, is that we were saying more than 2 years, more than 4 years, and so that's been adjusted to 2 or more years and 4 or more years. So there have been stakeholder comments proposing that we consider practically all the RNUs. However, the ISO needs to keep this process manageable. The ISO and the PTOs in particular need to keep this process manageable and focus on the long lead time upgrades with a major impact. We want to avoid having to assess multiple upgrades for overlapping groups of generators, because that could require an excessively complex and time-consuming iterative analysis in going through the allocation or the prioritization. And so, again, we want to focus on the big rocks, if you will, so that it's not overly complex, or at least try. Next slide, please. So generation projects in the affected cluster would submit information similar to the information that is submitted for the TPD allocation process. The ISO would score and rank those projects based on that information. And a reliability assessment would then be performed to allow the highest ranking projects to come online prior to completion of the upgrade. If the reliability margin, you know, as the studies are done, and once the reliability margin is less than 3%, then a limited operation study could still be required. There is some discretion for the PTO to use less than 3% margin, but the proposal is that no more than 3% margin would be utilized or held back. And then if the generator is in the range between, you know, less than 3% margin, but still there is a little bit of margin, you know, not over 100% of the breaker rating sort of thing, then the generator would still have to do a limited operation study, but they would get a priority over projects that did not participate in the process, and a priority over projects that were not selected and not given any priority. So there would be some advantage to participating even if you are in the less than 3% margin range, and and you're still below the rating of the facilities. And that was another clarification or refinement. Next slide, please. So this table shows the same scoring information that is proposed for the TPD allocation process, or more or less the same with some adjustments. An additional column has been added to include scoring data based on TPD allocation status and associated deliverability network upgrade status. For this intercluster priority process, the highest sum of the scores from each of the 4 columns, so one score would be picked from each column, based on the information, and then the sum of those 4 numbers would establish the priority. Essentially, the higher the score, the better, the higher priority. And then to the extent there are ties in the scores, those ties would be broken based on the short circuit duty contribution, if it's a short circuit duty impact, or a flow impact, if it's, say, a bus loading issue or something, or megawatt size if it's an IRNU, like a switch yard or something, depending on the network upgrade. The last entry so there was one adjustment to this column from the last paper based on some comments that, somebody pointed out some issues. And so the last entry in the GIA is basically the 3rd column there, the GIA status column. The last entry was modified. So now with an executed GIA, the customer would earn 3 points. It had something different before. Next slide, please. So, even though going through this process, you get a higher priority to not have to wait for the upgrade, it doesn't change, the fact that the cost responsibility doesn't change, and also the projects that didn't participate in the process or were not selected, they still need to wait for the RNUs. Next slide, please. So then this table shows a preliminary schedule for the 2025 intra-cluster prioritization process. The first public activity will be the posting of the list of long lead time upgrades that will be considered in the process. This will occur in July. Then in December, the results of the process will be provided, the priorities will be provided to the customers that participated in the process. The ISO will begin working with the PTOs in April on developing the list of upgrades and on the study plan for the study. And since just one thing to point out, Cluster 15 projects obviously will not be part of this process. So in principle, the PTOs could begin working on the models in the April timeframe as well while we're working on the study plan. If there's any work to be done to get the models ready to start the study. Then on October 8th, we plan to provide the scores for the participating projects to the PTOs, so then they can finalize the models and hopefully complete the bulk of the study work in November, when during that month there aren't any other interconnection studies scheduled to be ongoing, so they should be able to focus their attention on this and hopefully get the bulk of the work done. And that's it. Any questions?
Do have a hand up from Susan Schneider. Susan, you can go ahead. Susan, your line is unmuted. You should be able to go ahead. Okay. Susan, we're not getting any audio from your
Is
line.
this better? Is that better?
Oh, yes, thank you so
Okay,
much.
I apologize. I thought it was on my end. Okay, I have mostly clarifying questions. Susan Schneider, Phoenix Consulting. I'm mostly on behalf of LSA. There were some suggestions that this could possibly use, the same process could be used to provide FCDS to, if it were applied to DNUs, and so the projects could possibly get FCDS sooner and not have to wait for the upgrades. Can you talk about that for a minute? I noticed it's not part of this.
Yeah, I have to remember what my thinking was on that and what the comment was. Yeah, I think the issue was that if you when we do the TPD allocation, we've already allocated everything, and so there really isn't anything left to prioritize unless, it wasn't quite clear. Are you talking about something that did not get an allocation gets to move up and take some allocation from somebody?
No, I was talking about projects that have to wait for upgrades, say for 2034 when their CODs are 2028 or 2029 or something like that. Would it make any sense to think about applying this concept to give them their FCDS any sooner?
Well, Robert,
okay,
this is Bob
yeah.
Emmert. I just thought I'd speak up and say, we do have the interim deliverability process, and we had discussed having a multi-year interim deliverability process, which got dropped because you could probably explain it better, Robert, but it takes a lot of study work to try to develop or to do that. And based on our experience in checking that out, very few projects would ever qualify. So is that what you're referring to, Susan?
No, the interim deliverability was different. That was a multi-year, literally interim deliverability process. This is a headroom analysis. And I don't want to take up too much time here for this, obviously, but this was a headroom analysis to see if some projects could come online before, say, a large upgrade or something that would take a long time. And it just seemed, just intuitively, and it could be wrong, but it seemed like that process could also be true for DNUs, where a project could get its FCDS, not interim deliverability, but FCDS, if there was any room, because those upgrades are lumpy too, and so and are looked at for the entire group. So if you're saying is it may not make sense because of the TPD allocation process allocates already up to sort of whatever headroom there is. But then even if you have the allocation, you don't get your FCDS until the upgrades are done. And so my question was whether some projects might not need, that last really big 2034 upgrade and could kind of come in sooner.
Yeah, thanks for refreshing my memory on that. That was exactly my response to that, was that when an upgrade gets approved in the TPP, and then we go through the TPD allocation process, there's been so much demand for deliverability, as everyone knows, that we allocate everything. There is no leftover margin, and so then those projects, have a priority, and then when we approve another TPP upgrade for the same constraint, then we pretty much allocate all of that. So say in the 2023 TPD allocation, we allocated everything. Then we approve another transmission upgrade, and in 2024 we allocate some more, but they have to wait. The ones that got allocated in 2024 have to wait until 2034, sort of thing. There's really, since we allocated everything in 2023 before the upgrade was approved, there's no margin for them to, for the 2024 allocations to get.
So the allocation process effectively allocates all of the headroom that there is there.
Yeah, and because we don't trigger upgrades in the TPD allocation process, it's not like,
Right.
we go through and allocate everything, and then we have a few more to allocate. So then we trigger an upgrade, and we allocate
Right.
to those few more, but we have some left over. That's not the way the TPD allocation works. That's the way the reliability process works, but that's not the way the TPD allocation process works.
Okay. We'll give that some more thought. I had a couple of other questions. The intra-cluster priority, you had the chart up there, but what's still missing, I think, is that you are planning to first allocate by queue position, and where the earlier clusters get priority over the later clusters. So if one is, because you're using including CANUs and PNUs in this process. So if a project comes in and scores higher, but they're in a later cluster, they still won't necessarily get a headroom priority. Is that still the position? I know we had a little talk about this last time.
Yes. Now, again, it's a similar sort of dynamic, but I think slightly different, where, again, cluster 13 is allowed to interconnect, and they don't trigger some long lead time RNU, and then cluster 14 comes along, and it does trigger a long lead time RNU, and they have to wait for that RNU, and they have to fund that RNU. And so there's no reason for cluster 13 to wait for that long lead time RNU.
Well, let's say cluster 14 had a PNU or a CANU that was triggered by cluster 13. And so technically they could apply through this process to try and get headroom to get around that CANU or that PNU. But I think the way you had talked about it last time, it was that the cluster 13 was an earlier cluster, and they, even though they might not score as high as, say, a cluster 14 project that would come in and ask for the headroom, the cluster 13 projects would still get the priority. Is that still the position?
Yeah, I think it's the same answer. So whether it's a PNU or an RNU, so cluster 13 triggered the upgrade. Cluster 14 also needs it.
Yes.
But
so they could come in and apply, right?
But
because the proposal this time did explicitly say that PNUs and CANUs were included, which seems reasonable. But I think that you had discussed last time that the queue position was sort of override all of the different columns that, the.
Uh-oh. Did I lose my audio, or did we lose Susan?
No, I'm still here.
Oh, I think
Can you hear me?
Oh.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay.
So, yeah, I might just think about that one a little bit more. So cluster 13 triggers an upgrade, and you're saying that everybody after cluster 13 now gets to compete.
Well, isn't that the intent
early
of including PNUs and CANUs? Because PNUs and CANUs, by definition, are triggered by earlier clusters.
No, the intent is that some of cluster 13 could possibly come online. Actually, the intent is that let's say cluster 13 doesn't even have to wait for that PNU. They have to pay for it, but they don't have to wait for it. So then,
well, no, let's say they do have to wait for it.
Cluster 14 is triggering it, and so
no.
cluster 14 is effectively triggering it, and so then cluster 14 is competing for that PNU.
I'm sorry, I'm not saying that cluster. I'm not saying that cluster 13. Can you hear me? Can you hear me, Robert?
Yeah.
Okay. No, I'm not saying that cluster 13 isn't triggering it anymore. Cluster 13 triggers an upgrade that is also needed by cluster 14. Okay, cluster 13, now all of those projects in cluster 13 need that upgrade, and all their CODs are based on needing that upgrade. But in cluster 14, same thing. And so if I thought the intent of allowing PNUs and CANUs, which is very explicit this time in the final proposal, would be to allow cluster 4, if there's headroom to be had, to allow cluster 14 to apply for it. All the cluster 13 projects have their CODs, and they may not all want acceleration. Assume that's why you have to apply. So, they're to also request headroom that for that upgrade that had been assigned to cluster 13. So I'm not saying cluster 13 doesn't need it. I'm saying there's still there may be some have been some headroom there, and so can cluster 14 come in and apply as well? Otherwise, what's the purpose of including CANUs and PNUs? They're by definition triggered by an earlier cluster.
Well, PNUs can be TPP upgrades, and so
Okay.
that's one reason to include PNUs.
Is that
right?
okay? But CANUs have to be triggered by an earlier cluster.
And then CANUs can be triggered by an earlier cluster.
Well, they are by definition.
Yes, and it could be though that we haven't been able to do the reassessment yet, and yeah, so that's yeah. For the most part, I think it was more the PNUs, but I think maybe we did add in the CANUs as well.
Well, you did.
So. Yeah,
now I'm really confused about what your proposal is for respect to those things.
Well, for the PNUs, it's clear, right?
Well, no, because PNUs could also be triggered by an earlier cluster. So it would some PNUs might come out of the TPP, but some can also be because they were assigned to an earlier cluster and someone signed a GIA, and therefore now it's a PNU. It used to be a CANU, now it's a PNU, but that still could be triggered by an earlier cluster, so this still could apply.
Yeah. The intent was more for TPP upgrades, where you'd figure out which cluster is actually triggering it, and that's the cluster that competes against it.
So later clusters can't compete? They're not allowed to request that?
In terms of a simplification, that was my thinking, at least.
So how do the CANUs work?
The same way.
Well, the CANUs have to be triggered by an earlier cluster. So how would that work?
It basically, the cluster has a higher priority. That's already established.
Okay, well, that's all I was trying to ask. That's all I was saying. So it's possible for, say, in our example here, cluster 14 could apply, but even if they score higher than a cluster 13 project requesting it, the cluster 13 projects would have priority. That's what I thought you'd said last time. So I apologize for taking so long. I really just thought this was a clarification.
Yeah, and I kind of misunderstood the comment that I thought stakeholders were wanting to be able to leapfrog other clusters.
Well, it's not a leapfrog if you allow, in this case, cluster 13 to have first priority. Cluster 14 is not leapfrogging. It's just that maybe some of those projects won't want to accelerate their CODs because they've already got everything locked in with their PPAs and all of that. And so it does potentially leave some room for cluster 14 to come in and ask, even if you're going to.
For a PNU that was in the TPP that is being triggered by cluster 14,
how can it be triggered in the
cluster 13 projects that haven't come online yet, that a cluster 14 project should have priority over a cluster 13 project? That's the part that is clearly not acceptable.
But TPP upgrades are not triggered by any cluster. Yeah, TPP upgrades are not triggered by any cluster. They're triggered by the portfolio of resources that's completely separate from the cluster, or pretty much separate. So they're not triggered by any particular cluster.
They are, because they, that at some point the TPP upgrade gets approved. That doesn't mean every project that's not online is a PNU for. It's only a PNU for projects that get into the queue after it's approved in the TPP. Once it's modeled in the interconnection studies, it becomes a PNU. So if it was approved after cluster 13 in the TPP, cluster 13 doesn't have it as a PNU, cluster 14 does.
Okay, I think you guys should, potentially in your final, if you could clarify this, because the inclusion of CANUs does certainly imply that a later cluster could come in and that is also depending on the same upgrade, could come in and ask for headroom, even if they get lower priority for getting it than the cluster that actually it did trigger it, because CANUs, that's pretty clear, it was triggered by a particular cluster. Okay, the PNUs, if you only intended that to apply to the TPP, that's another clarification, because that also could apply to earlier, triggered upgrades. Just because somebody signed a GIA that made it a PNU doesn't mean the concept isn't the same. So I think if you could just give some thought to clarifying what you're doing here and explaining it, I think that would be really helpful in maybe a revision or addendum or something, so that people will understand what you're doing. I think that would be helpful.
Yeah, no, I agree.
Okay, and then I only have one or two. Hopefully this will go quicker, but I was a little alarmed,
we have all day, Susan.
Yeah.
There's no hurry.
I know, but I hope not.
2-hour lunch.
I think other people probably have questions too. So I was a little alarmed, and now I'm even a little more alarmed. If you look on slide 14, oh, yeah, here, this slide right here. In the written proposal, it says August 15th and not August 1st. And so I was for the affidavit due dates, and I was a little concerned when I saw that without the parenthetical statement you have here, because I went, well, why is it August 15th when all the other when the other affidavits are due September 1st? And now it's not August 15th. This is now August 1st, which was a whole month earlier than you had announced before for the affidavit due date. And I'm actually more alarmed now because it's moved back another 15 days. So now there's a whole month earlier for the affidavit due dates than what was announced as September 1st. And people are scrambling really to get their TPD retention, the TPD retention activities if they need PPAs or shortlists. And if for some people who know this is the last chance for them to go in as energy only to get, for pre-cluster 15, to get their MMA requests in if they want to add storage. There are a lot of people depending on the clarification that you'd issued earlier of September 1st, and this lops a whole month off of that. So my question was just obviously a question about why this has changed, and some alarm that it is because people really did rely on the announcement that you had made earlier.
Robert, do you want me to speak to that?
Yeah.
So, hi, Susan. This is Bob Emmert.
Hey, Bob.
We originally said September 1st date, which, as we talked further with the engineering team about our process of validating the affidavits that we get and when they needed their information, we were informed that, yeah, they actually wanted it on October 1st, no wiggle room on that one. So we started thinking about, maybe we need an extra 15 days. And then we started thinking about, well, gosh, we've got this new process that Robert's providing, and we're going to have to be validating those as well. And since this is the first time we're going to be going through that one as well, we thought, yeah, we probably need some extra time to make sure that we can meet the October 1st date for Roberts as well. So we moved it up to August 1st so that we will have time to totally validate all of them.
If you want to make this new process August 1st, that's one thing, because this is brand new. People are going to, they're going to have their inter-cluster priorities and things, and it's not as big of a deal as I have to get an executed PPA, although I know that's part of the part of the issue with your deliverability, but there's no PPA requirement or anything like that. But to take out a whole month, it's now pretty much March already, to take out a whole month for the other things that people are trying to do and had, based on the September 1st date that was, I mean, this is just a proposal now. So if you had to make it earlier, I'm not sure everybody be happy, but okay. But the date that was already announced where people were already working toward that, to just take a whole month off of it, I think it's a huge change to make in a final proposal. And I think there needs to be an opportunity for pushback on this. This is a huge issue. And I think I just think there, people had been relying on the earlier announcement, and just this. I'm not saying it pulls the rug out. It's not like a 3-month difference, but that last month is pretty critical. And I just think that's you need. There's almost no opportunity for pushback here, and I really hope you will rethink that, because I think that's just a. It's not many months to start with. It's a big process and a lot of things people have to do, and just lopping another month off is just, I think, is really problematic.
Okay, actually, I think what you're saying is probably doable for us to have a staggered date, August 1st for this process that Robert's describing, and then have an August 15th due date for
Or
the affidavits
September
for TPD
1st.
allocations.
September
Well,
1st.
no, I think we're going to have to stick with August 15th in order to be able to meet the timelines, because we don't want to delay the results as well. So we want to make sure that we can truly make the October 1st date for the studies.
Okay, well, are you going to put out another market notice? Is there any opportunity for comment on this? I mean, obviously we have comments on March 4th, but I just, anyway, I just, the change, it sort of takes away the benefit, or a lot of the benefit that you gave to people by announcing it in advance, which everyone really appreciated. I mean, I know is unprecedented to do that, but then to just change it, I'm sure others will want to say something about this too, but this was a real surprise, and not a good one. So I'll leave it at that, and hope you will reconsider even that. Okay. And then I have only just one more clarifying question. I apologize.
Well, Susan,
okay.
Susan,
Yeah.
I just wanted to point out one thing. It's the same information. So you want to submit all this information on August 1st and then resubmit it again, possibly changing it or something in September 1st?
No, nobody wants it. No, everybody wanted for the regular rate, not for this process, for the regular TPD allocation affidavits. Everybody just wants to submit it September 1st. They don't want to submit it twice. They just want to submit it once. And that was September 1st, which is what you told them they had till. So that's what everybody just, that's what I was just
asking. There will be actually
then you offered a concession that confused me.
No, I didn't offer a concession. I really wanted it to be September 1st. What I said, if you want this thing to be August 1st for this process only, fine. But the rest of it, you announced September 1st, and yeah.
But it's
the real issue here is you want an extra time to be able to actually firm up either your shortlist or your PPA to actually have those be, for a PPA, it's got to be executed. So that gives you extra time to actually get it done. Is that right?
I'm sorry. September 1st. The short list, the PPA, and also for anybody who is preparing or is about, in some cases, soon going to submit a storage edition to be able to get an allocation for it, because this will be the last chance to do that before COD. So there are people, I think, working on those things, and assume they had till September, because they have to have those MMA requests approved before the affidavit due date. And unless you're going to process those things a lot faster than some of those MMA requests are going through now, you're going to come off the knees if they have to wait. These things are not getting done, by and large, I don't think, in 60 days. And if they have to take 3-4 months to get them done, and you've taken off a month of that, it was, September 1st, I wasn't a concession. It was September 1st. Please keep September 1st.
But then what do we do about this process?
Well, this process, if you want to make it, if you have to make it August 1st to make all the rest of that work, then if you're going to cut somewhere, cut here, because this is a new process. Yes, people have to submit some of the same information and all of that, but it's not the same as saying I have to have an executed PPA. It's the PPA part and the retention part and the MMA requests, again, for people who are doing that, that you be really sort of cutting them off early, because that announcement was made a long time ago. And all I'm saying is if you could just keep that date for those particular things, that would be helpful.
So Bob, just to be clear, this is mainly for informational purposes. It's not really part of the proposal for ITRAC 3. the due dates for those are based on what the tariff requires, is based on a market notice to set those dates. So
Right, but you have issued.
Don't necessarily take this as the final numbers or the final dates. We can take that back and consider it. But
that's all I was asking. If you would please do that.
We have talked about it recently, and I think we're pretty confident that we really would like to make August 15th for the TBD affidavit requirements.
You might have talked about it internally,
but we'll discuss it some more.
Please do that. I say you might have talked about it internally, but the first I heard was any indication was looking at the August 15th date in the proposal, and then why? I wonder why it's not September 1st. And then anyway. So please reconsider. Is what I'm saying. And then I do have one more clarifying question. So I'm sorry to take all this time. And it has to do, I'm totally changing the subject a little bit, but the headroom allocation process, where you're basically saying that some people will need a limited operation study. And you said that they would get a priority over people who didn't participate in the headroom allocation, and they would, or people who did participate that were not selected, which is exactly what we talked about last time, which is totally reasonable. But it almost seems like what you'd have to do is give them more than just a priority, because you don't almost have to make I don't want to call it I don't want to like the word reservation. We'll talk about that later, but give them a reservation of headroom, because some of those projects, say a non-participant in that process, might get to the point where they're requesting a limited operation study because of they have an earlier COD. They might get to the point where they're asking for a limited operation study before the participant that did get the headroom allocation. So you'd almost have to make sure you don't give it away to that project that's getting there first, so that you will still have it for the project that gets there later. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's what priority means to me, at least.
Okay, it may be then a priority to me said, well, if there are two people asking, one of them gets priority over the other. But yeah. What you mean is something more, that you're not only going to give people a priority, you're going to actually hold it for them. Maybe that would be a good clarification. So that was okay. Anyway, just a request. Okay, that's all I have for this section. Sorry to take so much time.
Thank you.
Thank you, Susan. Thank you for your questions and your feedback. We have 3 more hands in the queue. We have Sanjay, then Tosin, then Alan, and then we have a couple of hands in the chat. Let's go to Sanjay first.
Hi, good morning, Robert. It's Sanjay Zhu from Colors on behalf of Kawia. I have a few quick clarifying questions. So now this is an ongoing process, so I just want to clarify for the RNU that initially doesn't meet the criteria as long lead time, then it gets delayed for whatever the reason. So in the subsequent years, it could become qualifying if it is delayed. Is that right?
I guess so. We just apply the tariff, and if applying the tariff means it now qualifies, I would think we would have to.
Okay, then the second question is about that the scoring matrix you have. It's the currently effective ones. So then you add another column. It will be used for 2025. Then in the next round, TPD allocation, supposedly the new TPD allocation matrix will be scoring matrix will be approved. Then for this process, it will also use the new matrix, right?
I'm not sure I fully understood.
If you go back to that scoring, the points assignment, so this one will
could you go back to the slide?
Right.
Yeah. Can you go back to slide, whatever it is, 12 maybe, yeah.
Yeah, this is the current one. The first 3 columns, some of those will change after this proposal, I think, after the TBD allocation stuff. Right, so at that time, so like a year from now.
Well, before you move on to that, why are these columns going to change? I thought these were pretty much what's being proposed in the TPD
like
allocation
for
system.
example, there's yeah, the new one is a little bit different, right? There's no PPA status. So based on the group, they are different.
Well, we had to tweak a couple of things because they didn't make sense, but otherwise it's pretty much the same. But I don't think there's any plan to change this.
Yeah, for example,
this is Bob Emmer. This is
no
we actually have
points.
two different scoring items or metrics. One for this process and another for the TPD allocation process. They're similar in many ways, but they are different in a few ways. So these are two separate scoring mechanisms used for these two different processes. And what Robert is showing here, that's not going to change. This is the final proposal, and what I will be showing later in my presentation will be the final for the TPD allocation process. And once they're approved by FERC, they won't change again.
Okay, yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
That's my question. Will this change to that new?
No, the idea was to use the same information, but these are the scores that they're going to get in this process for the same information. And they'll get different scores using the same information, but they'll get different scores in the TPD allocation, although Bob could clarify that. But yeah, like Bob said, this is not going to change. It's not going to be made exactly the same as the TPD allocation table in the TPD allocation proposal, if that's what you're asking.
Yeah. Okay. Then the last question is about you can say it could be applied to all the RNUs. Then you use the like a bus flow and in RNU as example. How about RAS? Will this process be applied to RAS? That takes a long time to be constructed, to be implemented.
It's an RNU, so I think the tariff would say yes.
RAS, how do you do that 3% margin? It's kind of like arbitrary depending on how you do the dispatch, right? So, well, so have you thought about like if it's a RAS, how do you define that 3% margin? You can always have it. You can always build the case such that there's no margin at all.
Well, hopefully there won't be any RAS. It shouldn't take more than 4 years to build a RAS. So we'll just hope there aren't any. If there is, we will do a study, I suppose, and calculate the flows. And yeah, we'll have to figure out something. But essentially, we'll have to figure out when the RAS is triggered, if you will, and then calculate the margin. It doesn't seem impossible.
Yeah,
it won't be necessary.
So actually, I think the real question is how would that work with today's solution? Today, you can determine on a case by case basis whether it can be handled through congestion management, right? So in the future, does it have to go through this more rigid process, or you can still rely on congestion management?
Well, if an RNU is being triggered, you know, and you're talking about for RAS in particular?
Yeah, for RAS, typically you can, in particular, you can usually apply congestion management and allow earlier interconnection. Yeah, it's definitely going to take some nuance. But, you know, the fact remains there is a RAS, it is an RNU, and it's required for that RAS to be in service for the generator to come online unless they go through the limited operation study process. Yeah, I think I go back to if there are any RAS, we may have to figure that out, but you know, I think that it takes 36 months, I think, for CRAS, I think is the time frame last time I saw, and that's not 48. Yeah, but then kept being delayed. So it could be 4 years. Okay, but thank you.
Okay, thank you, Sanjay, for your questions. Our next hand is from Tosin.
Hi, Robert. This is Tosin Kasami from Hecate Grid. Thank you for the exposition so far. I think you might have partially answered my question, but wanted to pose a hypothetical. Would an energy-only project which had met all the eligibility criteria laid out in this proposal, and which was near its COD, be eligible for intra-cluster prioritization, or does that not apply to projects that far along sort of in their interconnection process?
So an energy-only project is near its COD. That sometimes I'm not a very good listener. Could you? I didn't quite understand the question.
So yeah, near its commercial operation date. So 3 months out, or 2 months out from its commercial operation date.
Yeah, so then it would be impossible to be delayed by an RNU by 2 years if it only has 2 more months for its already approved COD.
Right. So in essence, an EAR project cannot be delayed from getting TPD by an RNU. Is functionally the thought here, or the point of the thought.
Well, if an EO project needs an RNU, it shouldn't be so worried about getting TPD. It should be more worried about coming online in the first place, because you can't get TPD if you're not online, or you can't get FCDS if you're not online.
Right.
And so so your FCDS can be delayed by an RNU because you're not online. Mm-hmm. But I thought in your scenario, I sort of assumed that when you said their COD was 3 months out, that they had in their LGIA an approved COD, and they're coming online in 3 months, and presumably the RNU will be done in 3 months.
Right. Okay.
So how would it benefit from this process, I guess, is what I'm trying to figure out.
I think that answers the question. I guess potentially failing in my own understanding, but yeah, that's a good enough answer. Robert, thank you.
Okay, good, thank you.
Thank you, Justin, for your question. Our last hand raised is from Alan.
Yeah, hi, this is Alan Combs with New Energy Works Consulting. I think I have a question, maybe a precursor question to some of the ones that Susan and Sanjay were asking, but just to be, it's the intent of this that if you get the intra-cluster prioritization with respect to a long lead GRNU or RNU, you're eligible for either interim deliverability or full capacity upon commercial operations, subject to things like, are there any other RNUs outstanding or DNUs? Well, so you can't get online without RNUs, but the subject to any other DNUs outstanding. I just want to make clear that that's the intent of this, right? That you're eligible for either interim or full capacity status upon commercial operation.
Yes, this has nothing, there's no linkage between this process and getting FCDS, other than the fact you have to be online in order to get FCDS. But once you're online, how you got online doesn't matter anymore.
All right. Well, I will say, I'll look for chapter and verse for written comments, but there are places in IAs that say until every RNU is completed, you will not attain, or precursor upgrade is in service, you will not attain FCDS. So it would be very helpful if you at least say the intent of this is to allow projects to come online early and, if eligible, attain either interim or full capacity, interim deliverability or full capacity status. If you could I think it would be helpful if you could at least say that in your proposal. So
I thought it did say that the LGIA would be modified.
okay, all right. Well, then we'll have specific comments. Again, we'll look for places where there are places where I've seen it as problematic or in conflict. That's all. And I will note that in more recent, I don't know if they're in reassessments. I think they're in the reassessments, identifying for the precursor upgrades, and I guess maybe can is whether they're impactful on just for deliverability or as, for energy only operations. So that's very helpful because some of these things are really just they may impact attainment of FCDS. You might still be able to get interim deliverability, but they aren't necessary to come online. Anyway, that's my comment. Thank you.
Okay, yeah, I'm pretty sure in the section we talk about the margin. I thought we did add in there that the LGIA would be changed if you have more than 3% margin. If you have less, then obviously your LGIA will not be changed. You'll need to go through an LOS.
Okay. Well, some of the template language just says as a matter of process that you're ineligible. So, but if you win this, or sorry, if you get this prioritization, and you can go back and amend the IA to clarify that this is not one of the RNUs that one of the upgrades we were talking about in a certain section, then that's fine. But I'll try to identify the language I'm thinking of, but I just want to make sure that was the intent. Thank you.
That's definitely the intent, but yeah, if there's something more that needs to be done, that would be good to know.
Thank you, Alan. Our first question in the chat was from Jerry Melter that asked, is this intra-cluster prioritization process also characterized as a, quote, connect and manage?
No. Connect and manage is, I think, more of a deliverability issue. I don't think they connect and ignore reliability issues. But my understanding of it.
I think connect and manage is more dealing with connection of energy only projects, and then managing the potential curtailment that may result. So this is different.
Yeah, that must be.
Thank you. And if that doesn't answer the question, or if you have clarifying questions, that can go in the chat as well. And then we had, I'm not sure if this was answered in the conversation with Susan, but Shakul Mazari asks, I just want to confirm that TPD affidavits are due on 8/1/2025 now instead of September. Is that a correct understanding?
This is Bob. I think we discussed that pretty thoroughly. So I think these questions came in the midst or prior to that discussion. So at this point, we will determine what the final due dates are and do a market notice to communicate that.
Okay, thank you, Bob and Robert. And Robert, is there anything else to cover in this section? Is this your last slide?
No, I believe this is the last slide.
Okay, wonderful. Okay, let's go to the next slide. Thank you, Robert, for your presentation.
Yeah, thanks, Robert. This is Bob Everett. I'm Senior Manager, Interconnection Resources. Let's move to the next slide. So as Danielle stated at the beginning, for the TPD allocation process modifications, there really has been very few changes in the final proposal from the draft final proposal. A few clarifications were made, and probably the biggest change is really related to the multi-fuel seeking an allocation process that as we got more and more clarifying questions, we realized it was beginning to take on a life of its own and becoming more complicated than really what the original intent was for that proposal. So we backed off on that one, and a later slide describes really the only single item related to a multi-fuel project seeking an allocation related to its PPA. So I won't get into that now, but just kind of set that groundwork. So for this particular slide, nothing has changed here. We still are proposing these 3 allocation groups where the PPA allocation group would have its first priority, the commercial operation group would be the second priority group, and then the conditional group would be the third priority group, where for the PPA group, they would have to provide a PPA that's been executed that meets the requirements of the tariff. Those requirements are not changing. For the commercial operation group, it's only going to be for cluster 14 and earlier eligible energy-only projects to go into commercial operation. And I would add also for technology additions for full capacity and partial capacity projects in cluster 15 and later can actually seek an allocation through the commercial operation group as well. And then for the conditional group, this is very similar to the Group D that we have now, but we are removing the restrictions. So with the restrictions moved, there's no reason that everybody wouldn't want to go ahead and participate in this group. So we will automatically include all projects that are eligible within a cluster to seek with this group. And everybody's eligible. It's just a matter of what cluster you're in and what process you're in. And so we will include all of the projects. And then utilizing the scoring process to determine which projects actually get a conditional allocation. Since we're studying 50% more project capacity than we actually have available TPD, roughly 2/3 of the projects could get an allocation through Group D and 1/3 would not. And similar to, as it works now with the Group D process, that the conditional allocations must retain their TPD by providing a PPA by the following year. And if they are not able to retain it with a PPA, they can seek it again and again. So a project can seek a conditional allocation for each of the 3 opportunities until they can no longer seek. So the fact that they may not have a PPA, they can then reseek to get another conditional allocation for the following year. And then if not retained, projects can reseek again. And the conditional allocation process will reduce the available TPD used to determine the amount of capacity studied in the next cluster. So again, none of this has changed, but I will open it up for questions on this particular slide.
Okay, we have a hand from Susan Schneider.
Hi, Susan Schneider, Phoenix Consulting. I do think, and this will apply for a couple of the later slides as well. You may very well end up. I know you said you don't expect any, or there may be any, or there may not be any. But the cluster 14 projects that are coming out of parking, if they don't get an allocation this time, and they qualify for a second year of parking, I do think you should be prepared for that. Maybe a couple of projects that may come in asking for a second year of parking if they don't get an allocation, and they'll qualify under the rules. So they would also, just to clarify here, that in 2027, they would still have the opportunity to come back and ask for another Group D allocation, potentially. I guess
right.
Modified Group D, but you wouldn't have that interim shortlist year.
Right, and that's spelled out in a table. So yeah, that's clarified in the proposal that if projects are eligible to park a second year, what's called extended parking, Group D would still be available to those.
Okay, thanks a lot. That's all I have here.
Okay, we don't have any other hands or any other questions in the chat.
Okay, let's move to the next slide, please. So beginning in 2027, the projects in cluster 15 and beyond will have 3 opportunities to seek an allocation of TPD. So Within that process, one of the items that we brought in and proposed and people have not opposed is that within the process, there is one additional allocation beyond the 3 allocations that occurs during the period that the facility study is going on for the particular cluster. So that will be an extra opportunity that all project will have. However, for cluster 15, the facility study will be going on in 2026, and during that time, there is no TPD allocation cycle. So for cluster 15, they will not have this extra opportunity to seek an allocation during their facility study. However, they will be able to seek their allocations earlier than future clusters would. They will be able to seek an allocation 4 months after the facility studies are done. So they won't have long to wait to seek for their first opportunity to seek an allocation. And this process is really designed to provide opportunities for projects to be able to secure a PPA when they don't have their facility study results. And those facility study results basically give them their final costs as well as capping those costs. But if a project has, little or no costs that are to actually interconnect that the facility studies will actually finalize, they may be able to go actually market their project and get a PPA based on what was available from the cluster study or the restudy. So in those cases, we want to give those projects the opportunity to get an allocation during the facility study, not have to wait. Because in most clusters, once the facility study is done, speaking of cluster 16 and beyond, it's about an 8-month process. They would have to wait after the facility studies are done before the next TPD allocation cycle. So this gives them an opportunity before that waiting period. But as stakeholders have mentioned, the majority of projects really need their facility cost information to really be able to definitively market their project to get a PPA. So cluster's first opportunity to actually obtain an allocation in all 3 allocation groups from the prior slide begins with the allocation cycle following the cluster study cycle. So just clarifying that during that one single opportunity during the facility studies, that's only for projects actually having to execute a PPA. And then finally, projects not able to obtain their PPA within their 3 opportunities, and those opportunities are both the allocation and the retention opportunities, will be withdrawn. So let's open this slide for questions.
There are no hands currently in the queue, Bob.
Okay, let's move to the next slide. Thank you. So for projects that are in cluster 15, cluster 14 and prior, there really are no changes until 2027. The new allocation process, where from the prior slides, begins in 2027, and as I stated previously, there is no TPD cycle in 2026. So the TPD allocation process for 2025 is unchanged for these projects. Really, the only change is we are reducing the amount of the study deposits that's required for energy-only projects that are seeking an allocation. We reduced that from $60,000 as a study deposit to a $5,000 fee. And we're maintaining for 2025 all of the current allocation groups A, B, C, and D. And just as a clarification, allocation group D is only available now for cluster 14 projects. And the 2025 allocation cycle will be the last opportunity for energy-only projects to seek an allocation through either the PPA or the shortlist allocation groups. After 2025, the only opportunity will be under the commercial operation group. And after 2025, cluster 14 and prior energy-only projects, well, I just did that, sorry. So any cluster 14 projects that receive a Group D allocation in 2025 must have a PPA in 2027 to retain their allocation. So that's the change that takes place for those Group D projects that doesn't occur for current Group D allocations, but does impact those that get a Group D allocation in 2025 where they must have a PPA. The shortlist option is no longer available. And then all projects that have sought an allocation through Group D will continue to be subject to the Group D restrictions that's in place at this point in time. So are there any questions on this slide?
Yeah, Bob, we've got two hands in the queue. We have Susan and then Mark. We'll go to Susan.
Hi, I'm going to apologize if I've got my years mixed up here, but if a cluster 13 project had a group D allocation and they were able to demonstrate a shortlist position, so they kept it, is this coming year the one that they would need to demonstrate the PPA? And if that, or am I, or is that just still cluster 14? I think this would be the year they would have to demonstrate an executed PPA. And I understood that if
That's correct.
Okay, so if they were unable to demonstrate an executed PPA, I thought that they would have the opportunity to come back and ask for a group D allocation this time. Is that right?
That is correct.
Okay, so it's not just
correct.
cluster 14 projects. It could potentially be cluster 13 projects that weren't able to retain
excuse me.
it.
No, that's incorrect.
Am
I'm
I
sorry.
off by a year?
Mistaken. Yeah, so Cluster 13 has completed their allocation process. So the only thing that Cluster 13 can do, well, there's two things. Cluster 13 must retain any allocations that were required for them to retain, such as if they were shortlisted in 2024, they must retain that shortlist by a PPA in 2025, but they cannot seek a Group D allocation after that.
Okay,
and
so
the
even
only
if
other opportunity is for the commercial operation group.
Sure. Okay. So even if they lost their allocate, if they weren't unable to retain the Group D allocation this year because they didn't get an executed PPA, I had thought that they would have the opportunity to come in and request another Group D allocation. Is that not right?
No, that's not right, because their allocation period has ended.
Okay.
And either they've been converted to energy only, and the only ones that wouldn't have been converted to energy only would be those that would have been shortlisted. And
right. I'm referring to those people. So if they come in and
yeah,
they can't retain the allocation, they're not allowed to come in this time and ask for a Group D allocation.
That's correct.
Okay. I thought it was the other way. Okay. All right. Thanks for clarification.
Thanks, Susan. Our next hand is from Mark.
Hi, Bob. This is a question about this slide and energy-only projects.
I'm sorry, Mark. Can you go ahead and introduce yourself?
Yeah, I'm sorry. It's Mark Smith. I'm with Calpine. So this clarifies that the 2025 allocation cycle is the last opportunity for them to seek TBD, that is energy-only projects. And I guess they're not removed from the queue. I believe they can still sit in the queue and eventually seek TPD through the commercial operation group. Is that correct?
Yes. 2025 is the last year that energy-only projects can seek an allocation to the PPA or the shortlist allocation groups. And that's primarily for cluster 14 at this point in time. But all cluster 14 and prior projects are still eligible to remain in the queue and seek an allocation in future allocation years under the commercial operation group.
Hey, Bob,
so,
it's Jason. And Mark, if I could jump in, this is Jason Foster with Queue Management. Mark, I just want to clarify just some terminology that you just said. So you said stay in the queue. Just so you know, the ISO will still be evaluating a time in queue and progression to construction or with construction and to commercial operation. So there is not an indefinite time in queue that these cluster 13 or 14 projects and earlier get to sit in queue. We will still be evaluating that and making considerations of time and progress as well. So just want to be clear.
Yeah, Jason, helpful clarification. I appreciate it. Thanks, Bob.
Mark, we've got two more hands up, Jennifer and then Abhishek. Jennifer, go ahead.
Hi, can you hear me? This is Jennifer.
Yes.
Great. So this is Jennifer Fletcher with Great. This is Jennifer Fletcher with Semper Infrastructure. And my question is on this bullet where it says the 2025 allocation cycle will be the last opportunity for energy-only projects to seek an allocation through either the PPA or shortlist allocation groups. And then in the proposal, it talks about energy-only projects cannot have a contingent PPA that requires receiving TBD. Can you clarify if an energy-only project can qualify for the PPA or shortlist allocation group with a contingent PPA only in the 2025 TBD allocation cycle?
Yes, that's correct. In 2025, they can provide a contingent PPA, or, you know, shortlist is not a PPA, so it would be contingent in the PPA group in 2025.
Okay, and then it's only the contingent terminology that's in the proposal is on those retention aspects. So for future retentions, it cannot be a contingent PPA. But they would have already received an allocation, presumably in the 2025 allocation.
Yeah, I guess it depends. Say that a project is has a PPA for the very first cycle that is available. It could be a contingent PPA in that case because they have not received an allocation yet. So we're not taking away a contingent PPA for projects that are eligible to get an allocation to the PPA group. And the issue is more for an energy-only project that is energy-only and can't get an allocation. If they, you know, we'll talk about that later, but if they want to extend their COD or do something like that, they can't do it on a basis of a PPA that actually requires them to have deliverability, when in fact that project actually can't get deliverability.
Thank you.
I hope that all makes sense.
Okay, thank you for your question, Jennifer. Our last hand is from Abhishek.
Bob, this is Abhishek from Rev Renewables. I just quickly wanted to double check my understanding about the discussion that you had with Susan. So I think I get it for cluster 13, but for cluster 14 projects that were able to secure deliverability using Group D in 2024 TPD process, let's say for some reason, if they are not able to retain that deliverability, I believe how I understood it is that they would not be converted into energy only and can actually participate in 2025 TPD as a Group D project. Did I get that right?
Yes. The second allocation cycle is for cluster 14 in 2025 will be their second opportunity for an allocation. So projects that are parked or projects that received an allocation that are seeking to retain it all have everything available to them in 2025.
Got it. And going back to the cluster 13 example, the project that would be converted to energy only if it cannot retain deliverability, I guess the only option for it in 2027 would be to be commercial in order to even participate in the TPD allocation process?
That's correct, in 2027.
Okay, got it. Thank you, Bob.
Thank you, Abhishek. And then we have 3 questions in the chat. The first question is from Selmia, who asks, can you clarify that cluster 14 projects that got TPD via Group D can retain this year via a shortlist position in 2025?
Yes, that is correct.
Okay. Next question is
So
from
again,
Michael Tard. Sorry, Bob, go ahead.
Let me just say, again, for 2025, there really are no changes to the process. So everything that was available in 2024 is still available in 2025.
Thank you.
So go ahead.
So I've got some questions. I've got 2 questions from Michael Tartibi. The first one is, if a cluster 14 project was allocated TPD based on being shortlisted and cannot execute the GIA by the deadline, will this project get to reapply under Group D in 2025 allocation cycle?
Yes, that's, I think it's the same question that Susan asked, and the answer is yes.
Okay, and then here's a revised question. Let me see if this is, I don't know if this is different. If a cluster 14 project was allocated TPD based on being shortlisted and cannot execute the GIA by the deadline, will this project be able to reapply under Group D in 2025? Is that the same question?
Yeah, I think it's the same question, but the answer is yes.
Okay. Okay, I have one last question from Simret. Would you clarify how a cluster 13 and earlier projects with Group D allocation would be treated if their current milestone dates are unachievable?
Well, how about if I open that one for Jason? He's the one that deals with that particular circumstance.
Can you, yeah, I want to make sure I understood the question before I provide a response. Could you repeat the question, please? And thank you.
Yeah, it said, would you clarify how a cluster 13 and earlier project with Group D allocation would be treated if their current milestone dates are unachievable?
Yeah, so the TPD process is going to be separate from the COD evaluation process. So the ISO is currently sort of in a hold pattern until the TPD processes are completed. Once the TPD processes are completed and we determine who retained, who didn't retain, there will be a separate evaluation to determine which milestones are achievable and which are not, at which point the ISO would take action according to those tariff provisions at that time.
And I guess I would add, I guess it kind of dawned on me that if it has a Group D allocation now and it's unable to retain that allocation, then what Jason just described plays out. However, if it is able to come back with either a shortlist or a PPA, then it's going to, for example, if it has a PPA, then we're able to adjust our COD to reflect what the PPA requests. So that'll play out that way. If it's shortlisted, then it has an additional opportunity to retain that shortlist in the following cycle with a PPA.
One more question in the chat from Scott Olson. Can an energy project receiving Group D allocation in 2025 retain this allocation in 2027 if it shows a PPA in 2027?
Yeah, I wouldn't say can it, it must. So if a project gets a Group D allocation in 2025, it must retain that allocation in 2027 with a PPA. Otherwise, it will be converted to energy only.
Okay, thank you. That is all the questions. All right.
Okay, well, let's move to the next slide. Thank you. So this is the scoring process for the TPD allocation process, similar to what Robert Sparks described, but they are somewhat different in some ways. So each of these two different processes have a different scoring process, even though some of it may be similar. So the scoring methodology is used to prioritize projects seeking TPD allocations within each particular allocation group. And it's used to determine the order within each allocation group. So the changes here that are shown in red are really pretty minor changes. The one under permitting, there were some comments that we received that people were concerned about the way it was described, where before it said draft environmental reports with no significant impact that cannot be mitigated. And there were some arguments related to that may not be appropriate. So what we did was actually took the actual BPM language and summarized it here. And so it's really the language that exists today. So it's really nothing new. It's just we changed the description of this 5-point item for the permitting section. And then for the PPA section, there was concerns by load serving entities that the fact that we had for the minimum requirement was an executed PPA. And so they wanted it to clarify that, well, for them, they don't need a PPA. It's really kind of redundant because for the 5 points, it basically says the same thing. That a interconnection customer that is a load serving entity serving its own load can get 5 points, but it doesn't hurt to have it here as well, just as the minimum requirement for those type of projects. And just to be clear, the way that this will play out is this particular table will end up in the BPM, but when we write the tariff language, we don't have a table in the tariff, so we'll be writing the tariff language to reflect these things in the most appropriate way. And then there is also a different scoring mechanism for those that are seeking an allocation to the commercial operation group, because obviously they've already executed their GIA and that's all done, and they've already gone through the permitting process, so that no longer applies. So the first priority group, and we typically don't see a lot of these occurring, so we don't expect to have this be very problematic, but we wanted to just cover it in case we did see multiple projects in a particular area. So the first priority will be for projects that having an RA contract, to where they demonstrate they have a PPA or an RA contract. So those projects would be counted first, and then if there's ties amongst those, we'd use a distribution factor to break that tie. And then if they don't have that RA contract, and there's projects that are in the same area, then we would use the DFACs to determine the priority of those projects. So any questions related to this?
Yeah, well, we've got 2 hands in the queue. We have Jasmine and then Jean. We'll go to Jasmine first.
Hi, Bob. This is Jasmine from AES Clean Energy. I think this is more so just comment feedback and really related to the GIA status column. I think when I was thinking about the process, noting that I know it's like a FERC Order 2023 requirement, but we will, for any projects moving forward for Cluster 15 and beyond, we will have like the deadline to execute the GIA will always occur before the TBD allocations, and that's something that we would really encourage the CAISO to concern either in this track or in a future track, that it does put a lot of risk towards the developers once we do sign the GIAs with a lot of funds at risk. But with the process right now, there's the certainty for deliverability is still really uncertain, because there's always 150% going to the TBD allocation process, and having the GIA be signed before going to TBD allocation is a lot of risk to the developers, and we really hope that in the future track that the CAISO will consider this problem and kind of find a solution, middle ground between the developers and what the FERC order requires.
Well, I will say that we have heard that comment from many developers. We understand the position that you're coming from related to that. We are still waiting for our order from FERC on the compliance filing, and our legal team anticipates that we probably have to go through more than one compliance filing round with FERC, based on past experience. So it's probably unlikely that we'll have any leeway to make any changes to that through the FERC process for Order 2023. And it would be something we would have to take up in future IPEs. Once the FERC Order number 2023 process has fully concluded with a final FERC order that doesn't require any additional compliance filing. So, when we would actually be able to consider this would be sometime after that process. By then, we'll have some experience of how well or how well it doesn't work. And we'll be able to take that into account, and maybe we'll have some ammunition for a future IPE to take to FERC based on that experience. So that's the ISO's expectation for that at this point.
Okay, that's helpful. Thank you.
Thanks, Jasmine. Let's go to Jean, our next hand. Jean, go ahead. You may be on double mute. We can't hear you.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can
Yes,
hear you.
I was on double mute. So this is Jean Lee with Southern California Edison. First of all, thanks, Bob and team, for putting this together. And just a couple brief comments on the PPA group language. I understand this can be tricky, and appreciate you kind of listening to some of our thoughts on this. So, I mean, I think the category, the interconnection customers, a load serving entities serving its own load, was meant to address basically a utility-owned type of project. And just a specific concern with that particular language is, there may be a situation where the interconnection customer actually isn't the load serving entity for a utility-owned project. It could be some other entity that the LSE has a relationship with or a contractual relationship with. And I think we all understand what the intent is here. But we, just wanted to make sure that there wasn't like a foot fault or something like that if it actually came down to implementation. So I understand you're saying that also this is when it actually goes into the document, it's going to be more narrative. So, and this is mostly kind of for BPM or presentation purposes, but just wanted to provide that comment. Thanks.
And if I, understand where you're coming from, thinking of an example where a load serving entity may actually contract with a developer to do a turnkey project that once it goes into operation, then ownership does get transferred to the load serving entity. And I'm sure that we can handle that type of issue and make sure that whatever contractual arrangements that you could provide would cover the PPA requirement.
Yeah. Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yes. Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Okay. Thank you.
And we have no other hands or questions in queue.
Okay. The next two slides I'm going to turn over to Jason Foster, since it's really more in his zone of responsibility. So I'll let him take it over from here.
Thanks, Bob. Hello, everybody. So just a couple, a quick review of what happens when we have modifications in the process. So on this slide, any technology additions that are either pre or post COD will be added as energy only. That's a standard practice today, and may only seek a TPD allocation in the commercial operation group. So this is a slight adjustment and benefit to the interconnection customers. This is only applicable to those projects that were studied as and came into the queue as FCDS or in the merchant study group, and that are currently eligible to seek a TPD allocation. The current tariff only allows energy-only interconnection requests, or I'm sorry, prohibits energy-only interconnection requests from seeking a TPD allocation, even when there's a technology addition through a modification request. And then just to be clear, this would commence after the 2025 TPD allocation cycle, so it would start in 2027. I'm going to pause here for questions because the next topic is slightly different. So.
Okay, we've got two questions in the queue. We have Susan and then Mark. Oh, and then one more hand. Sorry, Susan, Rhiannon, and then Mark. Let's go to Susan first.
Oh, hi. Yeah, just hello. Just a clarification, Jason, on the so when you this is again, I want to make sure we don't lose the sort of the post cluster 15 and later and the earlier ones. So projects that that are pre-cluster 15 can still add technology additions via MME or post-COD modification, and they would be allowed to seek an allocation through the commercial group, right?
Yeah, so I'll add some nuance and detail there. So I would say prior to the 2025 TPD cycle, cluster 14 and earlier can add a technology and seek a TPD allocation for it in 2025.
In 2025, right.
In 2025 only. So
right.
after 2025, cluster 14 and earlier can add technology to their generating facilities or interconnection requests, but that addition can only seek a TPD allocation in the commercial operation group.
Right. Okay. I think that, yeah, that's what that was my question also. So, okay. So even if they're if they're energy only projects, pre-cluster, cluster 14 or earlier, they can add technology additions, and for their actual project or the addition, they can still come in the commercial group and seek it later.
I think that was the same question, and my answer would be the same. That maybe, Susan, say that one more time. I just want to make sure I heard it correctly. Yeah.
So sure, yeah, I know it's confusing. An energy only project, okay. Well, I think you confirm that a project that, any cluster 14 project, regardless of its deliverability status, could add make a technology addition and come in as in the commercial group once that the capacity is built and ask for a TPD allocation for it.
Correct.
Okay, and an energy only project that is cluster 14 or earlier can, after 2025, if they don't already get an allocation, they can come in also later and after commercial operation and go in for the commercial group for a TPD allocation.
That's correct. Yeah, I would say correct, and I'll just state for specificity that, like in your second example, after 2025 and or 2027, all cluster 14 and earlier projects will have either received and retained their allocation or have been converted to energy only, right? And those that are converted to energy only can still add a technology, but the entire project at that point is only eligible to seek an allocation after they've achieved commercial operation.
Right. Okay, good.
Okay.
That was what I was asking. Thank you so much for the clarification.
Perfect. Thanks, Susan.
Great. Thanks, Susan. Our next hand is from Marianne.
Thank you. This is Rayanne Quadro with Gridwell Consulting. Jason,
Sure.
I had just a really quick, maybe overly simplified question. I just want to make sure I'm taking away the right information here. A project coming through the modification process, let's say a 20 megawatt solar project whose TPD allocation would effectively be like 3 megawatts, right? Could add a 20 megawatt storage and not increase their interconnection capacity, but potentially get TPD as a hybrid for that, increasing their allocated TPD to 20 megawatts or 18 megawatts based on sort of the effective capacity?
So the short answer is yes, as long as they enter, as long as they're only eligible for that TPD based on their eligibility at that time.
Yeah, coming online.
I just want to clarify again. Yeah, clarify again for specificity that the 3 megawatts that you're talking about includes the ELCC. The term is slipping my mind, but the ELCC factor that's applied to the solar. So the solar only, I'm assuming here, is considered FCDS, but with the ELCC factor applied, if we applied megawatts to the solar, yes, something like 3 megawatts is only applicable. So therefore, if a battery storage is added and they're eligible to seek an allocation, then they would be requesting to increase that.
Thank you. I think that your text reads like that perfectly. I just wanted to make sure that I was pulling away the right understanding. So appreciate your guidance.
Yeah, I'm going to pause there. I want to just check in with Robert Sparks or Benet and make sure that what I just said is accurate and or if I missed something.
Hopefully Benet was listening better than I was.
All right. Well, I'm pretty confident in my answer. Just wanted to double check.
Yeah, no, I was going to say the same thing. Yeah. Sorry about that.
Nice. Okay. No worries.
This is Bob. I'll confirm, Jason. Yeah, that is correct what you said.
Oh, perfect. Just want to double check. Appreciate it. All right, Mark.
Thank you, Ryan, for your let's go.
Perfect. Yeah, thank you.
Hey, Jason, Mark Smith with Calpine. This has always run through the back of my head. I know this doesn't apply directly to repowerings, but I want to make sure that these provisions don't restrict or change in any way, the ability of a natural gas facility to install batteries and transfer the full deliverability to the new batteries. There's nothing in here that complicates or contradicts that pretty straightforward post-COD modification process. Is that right?
That would be correct. Yeah. So a project could still, so an existing, I'm just going to create an example out of the air here. A project, the original generating facility could be a 100 megawatt gas facility. Add a 100 megawatt battery facility. Because both ELCC factors are 100%, the project could transfer some deliverability between resources. Collective generating facility is still FCDS. Independent technology types or fuel types are, adjusted accordingly, maybe FCDS or PCDS, or one's energy only, one's FCDS. There's a number of variables there. But yeah, the answer is that this policy will not impact a repower or an addition to an existing generating facility where just TPD is transferred between the two technology types. I think for purposes of clarification, again, in that same example, if you had a 100 megawatt solar facility that was FCDS and post COD came back to add battery storage, that battery storage could only seek a TPD allocation after it's achieved commercial operation. So kind of tying that example to Rayanne's example, that solar facility, that battery storage addition in this case is post COD, therefore this policy would apply for seeking an additional allocation to bring the ELCC factor up to a higher value.
Good. I'm not looking to increase COD in my proposal. It's merely to transfer it from a decommissioned gas plant to a new battery storage facility. It sounds like that could be a one-for-one transfer. Okay. Thanks, Jason.
Yeah. Yep. Sure thing. Thanks, Mark. Just to double check, any other hands or questions? Go ahead.
Oh, no other hands, but there is a question in the chat that I can read out loud from David Corzilius at PG&E. I just want to confirm what I heard and read on this slide. Only projects that request FCDS on their initial applications and then are studied for FCDS will be eligible to request FCDS allocations. If a project requests energy only on the application, then it is ineligible to request FCDS at any time after starting its study process. Is this correct? Or are there exceptions when an energy only project can request an FCDS allocation?
Give me 1 second. There was a lot of
Jason, this is Bob. I was reading that while you're talking, so I think I'm prepared. So basically, that is correct for cluster 15 and beyond projects. That an energy-only project coming into cluster 15 or later clusters cannot seek any allocation of TP, even through the commercial operation group. However, cluster 14 and prior projects are able to do that. In 2025, all groups are open to them, but in 2027 and beyond, only the commercial operation group is open to energy-only projects.
Thanks, Bob. I would agree.
Okay, so that is David's thank you. There's no other hands or questions in queue.
Great, thanks. Can we cruise to the next slide, please? All right, and then the first bullet here is just clarifying that we cleaned up the multi-fuel project policy that was proposed in the final proposal and simply clarified that multi-fuel projects requesting or retaining an allocation with a power purchase agreement will require the interconnection customer's TPD request to align with that PPA. And again, to be clear, by way of example, if the generating facility or interconnection request is 200 megawatts of POI, 100 megawatt solar, 100 megawatt battery, and the PPA is only for 100 megawatts, 50 battery, 50 solar, the TPD request and or allocation can only be for that 50 plus 50 max, or yeah, not or, but yes, that's the example. So, yep. And then the last bullet, there was some questions on the last stakeholder call and from the paper, and we added some language to the paper along with some examples, so I'll walk through those now. So this is related to power purchase agreements that are provided for energy-only projects. In situations where tariff provisions would apply or require power purchase agreement, the ISO will not accept PPAs for energy-only projects where a PPA is contingent on receiving TPD or they would have a resource adequacy obligation. I'm just going to jump to the examples here, and I know Susan and I talked briefly about this, but more specifically, Group D, once we get to the Group D evaluations and projects are being evaluated for their CODs, and there's potentially an attempt to remain in the queue for those projects or potentially extend their COD or maybe cure a breach if they have an executed GIA, we will accept PPAs to remain in the queue so long as they are for an energy-only product. And then same with TPD transfers. The new policy that was created in Track 2 is that when the TPD transfer occurs, that the transferring project is deemed withdrawn at that time unless it can provide an energy-only PPA. So we would only accept a PPA that is, again, for an energy-only product that is not contingent on TPD or has a resource adequacy obligation. It's the very specific examples that we have come up with, but it would apply globally to any situation where an energy-only project would be required to provide a PPA. And we can open up the lines for questions.
We've got two hands in the queue. We've got Susan and Jasmine. Let's start with Susan. Go ahead.
Hi. Okay, so just a clarification then, just sort of following on, I think, Jennifer's earlier question. If a project is requesting TPD, and so this says other than requesting TPD, if a project, an energy-only project is requesting TPD, then it's okay for the PPA to be contingent on getting the TPD allocation, right?
Correct, yeah. So I'll clarify, yeah, in so many words. So in 2025, and all energy-only projects can seek a TPD allocation, and including in Group A, where a PPA is required, right? So that that current energy-only project could have a PPA that requires deliverability. That PPA is basically allowing that project to seek an allocation in Group A and receive it, right?
Okay.
Go ahead.
Okay, and then just something that's always been, I think, understood, but is not really clear anywhere. If a project requires deliverability, or excuse me, if a PPA requires deliverability, and so it's being used to get, an allocation for A, or if it's shortlisted and requires deliverability for Group B or the shortlist group, the PPA can also have, I'm not sure what to call it exactly, but can it also have a provision that says if you don't get the allocation, then we're going to pay you less? So it doesn't necessarily say you don't get this, the whole PPA is contingent. It's just that, if it requires the energy, the deliverability, if you don't get the deliverability, then we're going to give you a price cut. Is that okay?
I don't want to.
In other words, you don't lose the PPA entirely, but your price that you've negotiated is contingent on you getting the TPD allocation or having to have a lower price.
Yeah, I don't want to say a definitive yes. It seems like a semi-gray area here where, we'd have to evaluate the purchase agreement at that time to see what the provision actually says and what the procurement and intent of both parties is, such that, right, is the developer willing to take the lower price and continue with development immediately following the TPD allocation cycle, right? It's not a PPA to continue forward or stay in the queue longer, but there has to be full intent to build the project regardless of that TPD allocation. So again, want to make sure that we're clear on that term, and we'd have to review the terminology on a case-by-case basis if that was the case. But I will say that we would be open to considering that, but I'd want to see the PPA and the contract and understand the intent between the parties at that time.
Okay, because I thought some of them had been accepted that way, and it's never really been spelled out. Because it just seemed like a project, if there is the possibility the project will build, and let's say they don't get an allocation in 2025, they might still build the project and then request it in the commercial group because the PPA would sort of allow for them to do that.
Yeah, I get that that's a plausible possibility, but we will take them into consideration and evaluate the PPAs at that time, and I think that's all we can commit to at this point.
Okay, all right, thank you.
Thanks, Susan.
Thanks, Susan. Our next hand is from Jasmine, and then we'll go to Lowell after that.
Hey, Jason. This is Jasmine from AES Clean Energy. I actually have a question in regards to the TBD transfer. I didn't notice there was a slide in the deck, but is this a good time to ask?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, so the proposal about allowing, like, permitting transfers from cluster 14 and earlier projects to cluster 15. So that's allowed, but going backwards isn't allowed. My clarifying question is, when we if we were transferring deliverability from cluster 14 to 15 projects, are we limited by any of the zonal approach? So, for example, like if you're in one TBD zone or one POI, is there any limitations of, like, you can't transfer it to a different project that's in a different study zone, for example?
Well, the transfer has to occur to a project that's connecting to the same point of interconnection and same voltage level. So I'm not quite sure how that would be a possibility.
Okay, but yeah, so it always has to occur at the same POI then. Is that correct?
And same voltage level, correct.
Okay, thank you. That's all.
Okay, thanks, Jasmine.
All right, let's go to Lowell. Lowell, go ahead if you introduce yourself.
Yes, I'm Lowell Watrous with GridSpeed. And I have a project.
Thank you.
I have a project that recently returned to service out of a extended outage, and it has a PPA, and the PPA stipulates best efforts to obtain deliverability. So their only avenue is through the TPD allocation affidavit process. How would that one? That's a little bit unique compared to the other ones that are in clusters and so forth.
So I guess my first question would be, in this project-specific example, I'm assuming they're energy-only deliverability status currently, and they return to service as energy-only still? Yeah, so if they've achieved commercial operation, then they're the commercial operation group, I guess, Group 3 or Group C in 2025 is the commercial operation group. Or if they have a PPA for that deliverability, they could seek in Group A because of the PPA qualifications. Yeah, in future, if it was a future 2027 and later TPD cycle, it would be the commercial operation group.
All right. Thank you, Jason. That's all I have.
Sure thing. Thanks, Lowell.
Okay, we have a question in the chat.
Yeah, go ahead, sorry.
Yeah, we just have one question in the chat from Kevin Pham. If a project transferred out deliverability and retained the queue position with an energy-only PPA, will it get to partake in the 2025 TPD allocation process?
Dare I say that's the best gaming situation I've seen yet. You know, technically we don't have tariff policy that restricts that, so it is a possibility.
Okay, thank you. That is all our hands and questions for now.
And that's my last slide, so I will turn it over to Bob again for second financial security.
Yeah, so let's move to the next slide. So thanks, Jason. So this is just a single slide topic to where just to describe the issue when projects are parked following their TPD allocation process. Its second interconnection potential security posting date is extended by 12 months. However, currently for cluster 14 projects that parked in 2024, their current due date for the tariff then would be 12 months later, which would be July 1st, 2025. However, with the adjustments that we've made to the TPD allocation cycles in order to accommodate the cluster 15 study work, we felt that we needed to make an adjustment to the required posting dates to the currently parked projects. So the ISO proposes to adjust that date for cluster 14 projects adopted to park in 2024 to May 29th, 2026. This is roughly 60 calendar days after the TPD allocation results are published in March of 31st of 2026. And this allows projects to do what they've always been able to do with that typical 12-month delay of posting to get their results of their TPD allocation process to know whether they got an allocation or not before they're required to make their posting. So this is consistent with past practices that we've been doing, and it actually delays it in a similar manner as the way it has worked for prior clusters. So all cluster 14 projects will receive an optional 10-month exempt COD extension where applicable. And when I mean applicable, it's really up to the project, whatever is appropriate for a project. If they want to take advantage of an additional extension of their CODs due to this particular issue, we will allow it. And the last item here is that customer COD extensions beyond the 10 months will remain subject to the CVC and other tariff provisions. So this one pretty much had unanimous support. There were some clarifications requested to this, but are there any questions related to this?
We have one hand from Susan Schneider.
Hi. Okay, so I just had a couple of clarifying questions about the 10-month exempt COD extension. So a project that goes into parking, I know some of them were offered, like I think a 14-month or some kind of COD extension before. So it's possible that they're coming out of parking and maybe they're not already out of date. And then this additional 10-month extension will help because that's for the TPD delay, the process delay. So that will help. But if a project is, if they didn't take the earlier 14-month delay, or if they come out and the 10 months is still not enough, they still have to go through, you know, especially if they had requested a group D allocation before, for example, they're still subject to all of those restrictions, right? On group D and all of these
correct.
things. Okay.
Right. You know, in your example, if they did not take advantage of the 14-month extension after their phase 2 study report, and now they're behind and the 10-month is not enough, well, they would have to request a COD extension beyond that 10 months.
Right. And if they had requested
the
group D
MMA.
before, then they will not be able to do that unless they have an executed PPA or something, right? I mean,
that's correct.
Okay. All right. And then I guess I will ask that you think about it. It seems sort of nebulous and up in the air, and I'm not sure what the vehicle would be to provide it. If there's a way to add in maybe something about there's a statement that says, well, if anybody's eligible for a second, extended parking, then we'll just deal with it then. Well, sort of where will you deal with that? Why not just put that in here? And say what you would do for that. I think it would just be helpful to have that additional detail as part of the proposal, so it all is really complete.
Yeah, I think that's something we would just handle as we write the tariff language. We're not going to put out another proposal to add that to it at this point, but yeah, that only makes sense. We don't want to have to go back to FERC.
Yeah,
requesting something, another change, in the rare case that if someone actually
like
is
3
able
projects
to do
or
extended
something.
parking.
Yeah. Okay.
Right.
Okay. So yeah, it's okay to do it through the tariff language. I just want to make sure it was on the radar screen only because you, like I said, you may get some. So okay. Thanks for that. Appreciate it.
Bob, it's Jason. I just want to add a little clarifying. So some of the questions we've grappled with internally. Sorry, I opened my WAC window. Some of the questions we've grappled with internally is how are we going to implement this 10-month exempt COD extension for all Cluster 14 projects? I just want to be clear that we are not going to issue 185 some independent reports that provide everybody a global 10-month extension. The way the queue management team will handle this is we'll have a separate tracker on our side that just says which projects have taken advantage of this and utilized that 10-month extension, and we trust that Interconnection customers will remind us that they can take advantage of this and bring it up in the conversations when there's a potential COD extension request at hand. So we understand it's a bit of a gray area. We're not defining it specifically, but we are offering it to everybody, and we'll track it internally.
That's helpful. Thanks.
Okay, are there any more questions?
No other questions currently in queue.
Okay, well, I'll turn it back to you, Yelena. This is the end of our morning session, and we'll be reconvening at 2 o'clock, but back to you.
Yeah. So Bob, if Danielle is still here, Danielle, would it make any sense to do the next 45 minutes, or are you only available for a shorter time? Oh, that makes sense. Danielle is not available because she had that conflict. All right, we are going to take our break now, and we will go to, Silas, can you go to the next page? So we're going to go to the long lead time resources section after we come back when Danielle is available at 2 p.m. So we will reconvene. Thank you so much. Hello, welcome back, everybody. Hopefully you are back and you've had a good long lunch and got some work done in between. We're going to go to the process for reserving TPD for long lead time generation and storage resources with Danielle Mills. I'm going to kick it over to her.
Thanks, Yelena. Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for well, I hope you enjoyed a long lunch, and thanks for bearing with us on the schedule change. We'll go to the next slide, and I will talk through the final proposal around qualifying long lead time resources. So as you will recall, we have authority to treat long lead time resources in 2 different ways under our current tariff. The first is that we give certain long lead time resources points in the interconnection request scoring process. That was a track 2 change. And for a longer time, we've had the tariff authority to reserve transmission plan deliverability for certain long lead time generation under our tariff. And so the proposal walks through the instances where we have reserved transmission plan deliverability. And maybe I'll just highlight here, when we do TPD reservations, it's typically they are not always tailored specifically to one project, but they are often tailored, sometimes they are, and they are often tailored more to a specific resource type, so a type of generating resource. So I just want to make that clear going into this discussion. Hopefully this will provide some clarity. As you may recall, in draft final proposal and previous proposals in track 3, we did propose an additional extension for long lead time resources to defer their first attempt to seek transmission plan deliverability. We're no longer proposing that in this final proposal. As I think we were clear throughout the process that we were going to try to get to a solution that had some good stakeholder comfort and consensus. But if we didn't, that this was something we felt we could pull out of track 3 and take up in a different initiative. And so that's what we've opted to do based on stakeholder feedback. We had some support for the idea and some concern around the idea, and a lot of comments kind of in the middle suggesting that we take more time for this discussion. So that is what we'll do. We'll take this issue up in the next IPE initiative, which will be later. We'll initiate that later this year and into 2026. So what the final proposal does do is clarify a transparent process for how we identify long lead time resources and when we reserve transmission plan deliverability through the transmission planning process. So we'll be putting more detail in the transmission plans going forward in the draft transmission plans and the final plans for approval around these types of transmission plan deliverability reservations, and we'll be coordinating with local regulatory authorities in the development of those of eligibility for resources that can take advantage of that reserved TPD. I want to acknowledge that having greater clarity through this process will also help us provide that clarity when we designate long lead time resources for the interconnection request scoring process. I think that's an area that we recognize we need to refine and more clearly communicate. And so we can take that up and discuss it further in the next IPE initiative too, but hopefully this, this process that we're outlining will provide that clarity and help smooth that process out as well. Next slide, please. Unless there are any questions.
Yeah, Danielle, we have a hand from Susan Schneider.
Okay, go ahead, Susan.
Hi, Danielle. Speaking for LSA, we have been trying to get our heads around the need for these TPD reservations, because it seems like going forward, the projects that have their deliverability, there's going to be some retention requirements and some other things, but going forward, projects that can get new allocations either have got to get an executed PPA really fast, or I mean, either right off the bat to when they get their allocations, which means they've got an LSE off-taker, or if they get a conditional allocation, then the very next year, they're going to lose the allocation if they don't get an executed PPA. And if the PPAs, if the LSEs are assigning PPAs consistent with the resource plans of their regulatory authorities, then projects, let's say there's a huge gold rush of solar and storage projects, and they suck up all the available deliverability, but they won't be able to keep it if they don't get executed PPAs. And since you're looking at long lead time resources, and they don't have the ability to defer their requested, their beginning of the TPD allocation request cycles, so they presumably will probably not come in till a little bit later. By the time that happens, the whatever might have happened with the deliverability they need should already be freed up for them. So we're just really trying to understand the logic of why you need to reserve and set aside these allocations if you've already, if pretty much everyone who gets one is going to need a PPA to keep it, and the LSE should be following their regulatory authority guidance. So can you share your thoughts about that?
Yeah, and I'm not sure I totally understand the examples that you gave, so we may need to work through this a little bit, but I mean, the transmission plan deliverability reservations have been used in the past for resources that will take some time to sufficiently de-risk, build, develop, and contract, but for which there's a clear stated policy need.
Right.
So resources like out-of-state wind or offshore wind, where we know that the contracting is farther out and the resource development needs to take place, but there's a need to build that transmission and hold other types of resources from taking that transmission up. So for example, the North Coast, and people on the ISO can stop me if you don't want me to use specific examples, but North Coast transmission is being built in large part to support the offshore wind development in that region.
Right.
So we need to make sure that there's a process for preventing other types of resources from coming and taking that deliverability.
Well, let's say solar and storage projects, which seems to be the concern here. So they come in and take that deliverability. They get an allocation. So they're either going to get an allocation based on Group A, where they've got an executed PPA already, or they're going to get it based on one of the other groups, which is, the ability to do that is shrinking because there's no shortlist thing anymore. But the ability in one of the other groups where in order to retain it, they will need an executed PPA. So they either have to have one right off the bat to get the allocation, or they'll lose the allocation and fairly quickly, like the next cycle, and then it will be available for other things. So projects can't get and or keep allocations anymore the way that you've set this up unless they have executed PPAs. And the LSE should be executing PPAs consistent with the resource plans of the regulatory authorities that are giving them guidance. And so it seems likely that when these resources eventually show up, the transmission will be there for them, because the other projects will simply not be able to, you're not going to have a portfolio full of solar and storage people, all of PPAs, because that's not the guidance that the LSEs are getting as far as PPAs are supposed to be executing. Does that make sense?
But it's locational specific, Susan.
Of course it is. Yeah, no, I understand that. But if the
they
LSEs
could all concentrate in one area and still not have enough solar, but you've overloaded the transmission.
Well, if the PPA guidance has any kind of locational element to it, it would remove the need for you to reserve anything. Because if the PPA guidance is don't sign a bunch of solar up in the North Coast, then the LSCs presumably won't do that. The portfolio guidance to them, I'm assuming, is something similar to what the bus bar mapping is that is given to you that you are using for transmission planning. So I mean, yes, everyone understands that it's location specific, but in terms of it seems like that could be managed on the other side and should be, and the projects that are not supposed to get North Coast deliverability shouldn't have PPAs up there.
Well, I think right now, Susan,
or they
we're
won't be
only
able to
trying
keep their
to
allocations.
Susan, I think right now we're trying to manage what we're able to manage and ensure that these investments that we're making in the transmission system are going toward their intended value and purpose. Right. And without any sort of checks in place, because I don't think there's anything currently in place right now that suggests that a solar or storage developer couldn't develop up there, except for the fact that the transmission plan deliverability is reserved, and and the
but don't they have
guidance
to get
and the
a
data that we
PPA?
provide. Can I finish? I think you're making a lot of assumptions about what could or could not happen, and we have this process in place under our tariff to ensure that things happen as they should, and that the development is coordinated between the resource plans and the transmission plans as intended.
Okay, well, anyway, I've said my piece, but we're still kind of scratching our heads over why you're worried about it if the PPAs are signed the way they're, if the guidance is provided at the other end to make this happen. So anyway, that's all I'm going to say about it. I don't want to take up any more time, but thanks.
Okay, thanks. Any other questions?
There's no other questions in queue right now, Danielle.
Okay. So the process for determining which resources qualify as long lead time resources or what types of generation deliverability will be held for is as follows. First, in the ISO's transmission planning process, we will put forward standards that specify what types of resources will qualify to be eligible for reserve TPD, specifically the resources that support public policies requiring new transmission. And there's some guidance in the final proposal that we've had in there for quite some time. Those are not necessarily the standards. That's just an articulation, I think, to Susan's question of why we're doing this, the types of resources that we do reserve transmission plan deliverability for. And so after we put out after initiating the transmission planning process and putting out the standards, the LRAs will all have an opportunity to review the standards that we put forward. So this will be for every transmission plan, and they will provide the ISO with a more explicit list of qualifying resources eligible to compete for that TPD. So if they want to put a finer point on the types of resources that will be eligible, they can do so. And we can do this down to the bus bar level, so it's very clear at the outset of the interconnection request process where we'll be reserving deliverability for stakeholders. So for example, we expect, and we've seen the PUC provide its list as part of the decision conveying TPP scenarios for the TPP before the TPP commences. So we're in the process of starting our 2025-2026 transmission planning process. That's where we'll take a look at the CPC's list. We can build on that because there's potential for other qualifying resources to be included by other local regulatory authorities as well. And then we'll open that all up for stakeholder comment in our transmission planning process, just to resolve any questions and a lack of clarity around that. And then finally, the ISO board approved transmission plan will include descriptions and details of the qualifying long lead time resources for each long lead time policy upgrade specific to that transmission plan and to inform the next interconnection request intake process. So hopefully that's clearer than it is now. I know we heard a lot of requests from stakeholders for improved transparency around this process, and so that's what this is intended to do.
Okay, we have a couple of hands up. Susan, I think that's a new hand, and then we have Mark after that.
Yeah, hi, this is less contentious, I promise. So there's still a little confusion, I think, in terms of when it will be, what you mean by resource types versus individual resources. Are you, for number 2, are you assuming that there might be a list of actual projects that people will be able to see and comment on? Or are you thinking resource types and locations, or just what does that mean in your sub number 2 there under number 2?
So we're keeping that a little bit flexible right now because, I think every type of resource development, whether you're talking about long duration storage or offshore wind, is a little different in how it develops. And, for offshore wind, for example, we have kind of a known universe of leaseholders that we can consider. Who would theoretically be eligible for competing for the transmission plan deliverability. That may not be the case for geothermal or long duration energy storage. So that level of detail would become clearer as we go through the process.
So in the transmission plan, are you assuming these resources would not be in the queue yet? The individual ones?
In some cases, that may be the case. Yeah, that's not a binary yes or no answer.
Okay, so some of these resources could be listed here that aren't even in the queue yet.
Yes.
Okay, and you would be looking to the LRAs to tell you which ones those are?
Potentially.
Or would you find is there some other place that you get that information?
Yeah, I think we would be looking to the LRAs for it, but they may not have that either. So it may just be open to, it may just say, for example, long duration energy storage at this point of interconnection.
Okay, so it could just be resource types and the locations, perhaps.
Yeah.
Okay, and just for a clarification, I know you had 426 megawatts of wind there, and it was called Central Coast. Was that Morro Bay or Humboldt, or Diablo Canyon? Can you clarify where that reservation is?
Benet, are you able to?
Yeah, can you hear me? It's the Central Coast.
Yeah, but where in the Central Coast? Is it more?
I think there's only one call. I think there's only one call area, right? Central Coast. I think it's called Morro Bay Call Area.
But which POIs does it include? Usually deliverability seems like it's very location specific. When you guys did the bus bar mapping or the POI mapping for cluster 15, there were really very specific locations. And I'm just wondering, the 426 megawatts, do you assume it is living at Morro Bay or someplace else? What's the assumption there?
It's either Diablo Canyon 500 kV or switching station out of that Diablo Canyon if Diablo Canyon is not feasible. Those are the POIs right now.
I'm sorry, just Diablo Canyon 500. What was the other one?
The line coming out of Diablo Canyon. If Diablo Canyon interconnection is not feasible. What's that? Yeah.
Would that be the Diablo Gates line?
Uh-huh.
Okay, so either of those. So okay, so it's not Morro Bay or Humboldt or anything like that.
No, not Humboldt. Definitely not Humboldt. We're talking about Central Coast.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. Well, depending on Okay. Great. Thank you. I appreciate the clarification.
Sure.
Okay. Thanks, Susan. We have another hand from Mark Smith.
Hey, Danielle. It's Mark Smith with Calpine. First, I think the added transparency here is a really good step forward. To have an open process where we can talk about what kind of projects and where those projects would be sited and reserving transmission for those projects explicitly, that's much better than what has happened in the past. Let me just say that much. But if we're actually going all the way down to the bus bar and identifying locations and resources, those resources then will know for sure that they have deliverability. And I'm just wondering if you need to be concerned with the market power associated with those developers in those locations. because they could probably offer any price, right? Knowing that they're the only ones that will have deliverability. It's just something to think about. I think it's a concern, especially if you go all the way down to bus bar mapping and reserve capacity. I don't know if you can do any other way, but you might want to think about that a little bit. That's all, just a comment. Thank you.
Thanks, Mark. And we'll make sure that we talk to the LRAs about that too, because I see that as being one of those issues that's very closely tied to procurement, which, as you all know, we have a little less authority over, but I can understand some of the sensitivities around that.
Okay, and we have one question in the chat from Alan Combs. Will this long lead time policy apply to the transmission capacity or network upgrades necessary to make deliverable generation on an out-of-state subscriber line? Note that although the subscriber line may be out of state, the CAISO upgrades necessary make the SL generation deliverable be in state.
So I might ask for a little help on this, but I think the short answer is that this could apply to transmission capacity or network upgrades necessary to make an out-of-state subscriber line or SPTO work, or to reserve capacity associated with that development. I'll see if there's any input from the transmission planning team about whether that makes a difference, of whether it's CAISO upgrades within the ISO or a new transmission project.
Danielle, it's Jeff here. Your answer is correct there, and that's similar in terms of to MIC expansion. If we end up with the SPTO that expands the CAISO grid there, it's the same thing. So yes, the internal transmission to make the out-of-state resources would be considered in the same way, kind of in that fashion.
Thanks, Jeff.
Okay, and I think we have a new hand from Susan Schneider.
Yeah, hi. I'm just with a question with respect to the reservation at Diablo Canyon. If a project that is in the queue that is coming, say, out of parking, that is a long lead time resource, requests a TPD allocation, would it come out of that amount at that location? If it's already in the queue?
The project is in parking?
If it's coming out of parking.
Yes, it could, well, if it meets the criteria and we've reserved transmission capacity for a resource like that, then it could compete for it. Yes.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
We don't have any other hands or questions in the chat.
Okay. Thanks, everyone. We'll go to the next slide then. Okay. So I want to clarify, and actually we posted an updated version of the final proposal today, just to make sure that this part is clear. The ISO will only reserve transmission capacity consistent with the amount included in the LRA's resource portfolios. So we are not taking any liberties going above or beyond or less than the amount that's submitted to the ISO in the LRA plans and that will go through in the transmission planning process. The piece that I clarified in the final proposal, there was, when I talked about there were sort of guidelines for what types of resources we considered this policy change for, and it said something about interconnection customers only being able to submit or only being able to request capacity up to that amount. That's not a requirement that we're actually placing on anyone in the queue right now. We're just saying, I mean, it's still true that if a project is competing for reserved transmission capacity, that project will have to compete, and we're only reserving a certain amount. So for any amount above that, there will need to be competition. So Mark, that may help with your point, but I want to make clear that that's not necessarily one of the guidelines. It was just kind of an oddly placed sentence that I missed. So hopefully that's not throwing anyone off. But nonetheless, we are only reserving the transmission capacity consistent with what's in the LRA's portfolios.
And if a resource seeks additional deliverability beyond what's in the portfolio, they will have to compete for that, as any other resource competes for transmission plan deliverability in our system. And if there is a tie between two resources that are competing, we would use the same tiebreaker of a COD as is proposed elsewhere in the final proposal around TPD allocations. Any questions there?
Yes, we have one hand from Susan and one hand from Songja. We'll go to Susan first.
Okay, I'm not clear. I understood the clarification, but because I don't think COD is a tiebreaker in most any other place, and I'm not sure. Anyway, okay, so the idea that they could only request up to a certain amount, what at a particular, what amount of available deliverability at that particular location for each individual developer can, like, so if there's 1,000 megawatts available at a particular POI, each developer can submit up to 1,000 megawatts?
So it's no longer that's what I took out of the paper. So the clarification in the paper, there was an oddly placed sentence there that said that interconnection customers could only request up to the reserved amount, and I took that out because that is not a requirement that we have in place.
Okay, so they could request
interconnection
more.
Customers can request to any amount, but we are only reserving the amount in the portfolios.
Okay, so if there's 1,000 megawatts available at a particular POI and you've got 3 developers and they each submit requests, we talked about this a little bit last time and we had sort of 2 different answers from 2 different people at the CAISO, and maybe it's not down to that level of detail yet, but if you had one POI and there's 1,000 megawatts reserved there and there's 3 developers and they each want 1,000 megawatts, do they each have to, so they all compete, but so 1,000 megawatts gets an award from somebody, and then does the rest automatically start competing for the non-reserved, or are they out, or because they didn't? How does that work?
They would compete for the non-reserved.
Okay, so you have 3,000 megawatts in my example competing for 1,000 megawatts. So 1,000 megawatts if somebody gets that, and then there's 2,000 extra megawatts. Okay, and so the 2,000 extra megawatts, however they score, do they still get long lead time points for that extra capacity?
Well, it depends on where they are in the queue. If they haven't entered the queue, then yes, and it's specified in the portfolio. So those are kind of 2 different separate processes.
Right. Okay. And then, okay, so in the TPD allocation process, then then 1,000 megawatts gets that. You have 2,000 megawatts kind of hanging around now. They either could go for group A or group. They just have to go into the regular groups and compete with everybody else in that way.
They will, yes. They compete as everyone else does for all the non-reserved capacity.
Okay. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, and the other hand has been lowered, so no other questions in queue.
Okay, thanks. Good clarification. We'll go to the next slide then. Okay, so we did, I think in previous iterations of the paper, we kind of touched on this idea of now that we're reserving transmission plan deliverability, when do we release that reserved transmission plan deliverability if a project doesn't come to fruition? And so we have a couple of circumstances where that would occur. These need to happen formally from the entity that's associated with the cancellation. So either a formal cancellation of the policy-driven transmission project, which would come through the ISO in the transmission planning process, or the resource would have to be later removed from the LRA's portfolio that requested it due to the project's failure. And so this would come with formal written notice or a decision by the LRA that originally included the project in its portfolio. And in both of these instances, we would go through the ISO's transmission planning process to be clear of this release of the reservation. Any questions on that?
Okay, I think that's a, Susan, is this a new hand?
Yeah, it's a new hand. Sorry, quick one. So it's when you say the resources removed from the LRA's portfolio, it sounds like because it could be either a specific project or a resource type at a location or something like that. Then when you say the resources removed, it could be, again, a particular project, or it could be the resource type, the LRA is reducing its resource at that location or moving it somewhere else, taking it away, so then you don't need it from the LRA. So it could be either of those things, right?
Right.
Okay. All right. Thanks.
Okay, Danielle, no other hands in queue.
Okay, we'll go to the next slide then, please. All right, that's the proposal around long lead time generation and how we'll identify it and reserve TPD for it. So, Elena, I'll hand it over to you.
Okay, thank you. Let's go to the next slide. So here's just an overview for what we have left of this initiative. The comments are going to be due on March 4th by end of day, and then we're going to be seeking approval from the board at the end of March. Next slide. And just our normal initiative page link here and how to submit comments. And if you have any other questions, please feel free to reach out to us at any time. And then I just have one last slide. If you go to the next slide, just our usual plug for if you want to subscribe to the Energy Matters blog and anything that we post there if you want to stay in the loop. And thank you so much for your discussion today and for your questions and your hands and questions in the chat, and thank you to all the presenters. Please feel free to reach out to us, and thank you for joining today.